Absolutely. And then Schwarzenegger, I've read that you guys actually hated each other for a while.
Well, we were very competitive. Yeah, I think hate's a good word. He walked in the room, and I hated it. I thought, give me a break.
Sylvester Stallone was once seen as Hollywood's ultimate fighter, the man who turned rejection into glory and made Rocky Balboa a symbol of impossible dreams. But behind the fame, the muscles, and the roaring box office success, there was one man he could barely stand. Their rivalry was not just friendly competition, it became a private war built on pride, public humiliation, jealousy, and one cruel Hollywood trap. So what really happened between them? And why did Stallone hate him more than anyone else? The rival enters. In 1977, Sylvester Stallone walked into the Golden Globes as a man who had already forced Hollywood to change its mind about him. Just a short time earlier, he had been struggling, unknown, and dismissed by studios that did not see him as leading man material. Then came Rocky, a script he refused to sell unless he could play the role himself. That decision carried risk, but it paid off. Now he stood inside the Beverly Hilton, surrounded by the very people who once turned him away, watching as his work was recognized on one of the industry's biggest stages. The room was filled with power. Producers, directors, actors, and journalists gathered under bright lights and quiet tension. Conversations moved quickly, but attention kept shifting back to Stallone. He was no longer just another name trying to break through. He had arrived, and everyone in that ballroom knew it. His presence carried weight, but it also carried expectation. This was not just a night of celebration. It was a moment where his future would begin to take shape in front of the entire industry. Not far from him stood Arnold Schwarzenegger. At that time, Arnold was still early in his acting journey, but he was already drawing attention. His background in bodybuilding had given him a level of visibility few newcomers had. He did not blend into the room. He stood out, not only because of his size, but because of the confidence he carried. While others moved carefully through conversations, Arnold seemed comfortable, as if he already knew where he was headed. The contrast between the two men was immediate and clear. Stallone's rise had been built on struggle, rejection, and persistence. His image was tied to emotion, to effort, to a story people could relate to. Arnold represented something different. His presence was built on control, discipline, and a physical standard that few could match. Where Stallone told a story through hardship, Arnold presented a vision of power. That night placed them in the same space at a very specific moment in their lives. Stallone had just proven that he belonged at the highest level. Arnold was preparing to reach that same level in his own way. The industry noticed. Conversations, comparisons, and quiet observations began to form. People did not need to say it out loud. The contrast spoke for itself. Hollywood has always been drawn to contrast. It builds stories around it, markets it, and turns it into something audiences can follow. Stallone and Arnold fit into that pattern naturally. They were different in style, different in presence, and different in how they approached their careers. Yet, they were also similar in one important way. Both were determined to stay at the top once they reached it. As the night continued, the focus remained on Stallone's achievement, but the wider picture was already taking shape. Two strong personalities, two rising forces, and one industry that rarely allows equal space for both. It did not require conflict at that moment. The foundation had already been set through visibility, comparison, and expectation. By the time the event ended, nothing had been openly declared. No confrontation, no direct challenge, no public dispute. Yet the memory of that night stayed with both men. It marked the first time they were placed side by side under the same spotlight, with the same audience watching closely. What began as comparison soon hardened into something sharper, and one tense moment at the Golden Globes would follow them for years. The ballroom tension. The 1977 Golden Globes did not begin as a battleground, but by the end of the night, it carried a tension that extended far beyond awards and applause. Rocky had secured nominations in major categories, placing Sylvester Stallone at the center of attention. For a man who had once struggled to be taken seriously, this moment carried both validation and pressure. Every glance, every reaction, and every outcome felt significant. Arnold Schwarzenegger was also present that evening, recognized for his role in Stay Hungry. Though still early in his acting career, his presence did not go unnoticed. He stood apart from the usual Hollywood mold. His background in bodybuilding, his size, and his posture made him impossible to ignore. While many newcomers observed quietly, Arnold moved with a sense of certainty that suggested he did not see himself as temporary. As the ceremony progressed, the differences between the two men became more visible. Stallone's connection to Rocky was deeply personal. The film reflected his own struggles, his persistence, and his refusal to be overlooked. Every nomination felt earned through effort. Arnold's image, on the other hand, was built on discipline and physical presence. He represented something new, something that did not rely on the traditional path through acting. Inside the ballroom, reactions mattered. Applause rose and fell. Names were announced, and each result shifted the mood. Stallone remained focused, but the weight of the moment stayed with him. This was not just about winning. It was about recognition from an industry that had once rejected him. Around him, conversations continued, but the air carried a quiet intensity. Arnold's presence added to that intensity. He was not directly competing with Stallone in the same categories, yet the comparison formed naturally. People observed both men, measured them in their own ways, and began placing them into separate but connected spaces within the industry. One represented a story of struggle. The other represented physical dominance and certainty. By the time Rocky secured Best Picture, the atmosphere shifted again. The moment marked a peak for Stallone, confirming his place at the top of a rapidly changing landscape. The applause was strong, the recognition clear. Yet even within that success, the earlier tension did not disappear. It lingered in small moments, in quiet observations, and in the awareness that the spotlight was no longer focused on just one type of star. The night became more than a celebration. It became a point of reference. Those who attended would later remember not only the awards, but the presence of two men whose careers would soon run alongside each other in constant comparison. There were no direct confrontations, no open challenges, but the atmosphere carried something unsettled. Hollywood thrives on contrast, and that night offered a clear example. Stallone's path had been difficult and emotional. Arnold's approach appeared controlled and strategic. The industry saw both and began shaping expectations around them. Without formal declaration, a rivalry began to take form through observation alone. After the ceremony ended, the conversations did not stop. Industry figures continued to discuss what they had seen. A new star had arrived. Another was rising. The idea that both could dominate the same space created curiosity, and that curiosity would grow into something more persistent over time. The Golden Globes of 1977 did not create conflict on the surface, but it set the conditions for it. The comparisons made that night would continue, building through films, public appearances, and shifting expectations. What seemed subtle in the moment would later become much clearer. Soon, that tension would move far beyond one ballroom, turning into a battle measured through bodies, roles, weapons, and box office numbers. Muscles became the message. During the 1980s, Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger moved beyond being rising stars and became the defining faces of the action genre. Their names were no longer tied to single films. They were tied to entire identities that audiences could recognize instantly. Stallone carried Rocky and Rambo, two characters shaped by hardship, discipline, and persistence. Arnold carried Conan, Commando, and later Predator, roles built around dominance, physical force, and control. These roles did more than entertain. They created two distinct images of strength. Stallone's strength appeared earned through struggle. His characters absorbed damage, endured pain, and continued forward. Arnold's strength appeared absolute. His characters rarely showed weakness. They advanced with certainty, often overpowering everything in their path without hesitation. Studios quickly understood how powerful this contrast could be. Marketing began to highlight their differences, even when it was not stated directly. Posters emphasized physique, posture, and presence. Trailers focused on scale, impact, and intensity. Interviews reinforced the image. The audience responded, and comparison became part of the experience. Training became a central part of that image. Stallone pushed his body toward a lean, defined form, especially visible in Rocky III, where his physique looked sharply cut and controlled. Arnold maintained a larger, fuller build that reflected his bodybuilding background. Each appearance, each public event, and each film release carried that visual contrast forward. Weapons and action design also became part of the message. Rambo introduced heavy weaponry used with precision and purpose. Commando answered with even larger displays of force. The scale increased on both sides. Each film raised expectations for what an action sequence could look like. Explosions grew bigger, fights grew longer. The sense of impact became more extreme. Even body count became a measure that audiences tracked. Numbers were not always stated, but they were noticed. One film would present a high level of destruction. The next would exceed it. The escalation was not accidental. It reflected a steady push to remain ahead in a genre that demanded constant expansion. Public appearances carried the same tension. Photographs showed them side by side, often with both men maintaining controlled expressions. Their posture, their stance, and even their positioning became part of how they were perceived. The audience saw two figures who were always being compared, even in still images. The rivalry also shaped casting decisions. Projects were selected with awareness of what the other had done or was about to release. Timing mattered. One film could influence the direction of another. The result was a cycle where each move carried weight beyond its own success. It contributed to a larger pattern that both men were part of, whether directly acknowledged or not. As the decade progressed, the action genre itself began to take on their influence. The idea of the lone, powerful figure facing overwhelming odds became a standard. The visual of a heavily built hero carrying advanced weaponry became expected. Audiences began to associate that image with both Stallone and Arnold, even as they maintained their differences. What started as comparison turned into a structured form of competition. It was visible in training, in film design, and in public perception. The industry encouraged it, the audience followed it, and both men continued to build within it, pushing the boundaries of what the action hero could represent. By the late 1980s, the pattern was clear. Each new project did not exist in isolation. It entered a space where expectations had already been raised. Success required not only meeting those expectations, but surpassing them. That pressure remained constant. But the harder they worked to look unbeatable, the more the pressure began to move from the screen into their real lives. The body-paid first Sylvester Stallone built his reputation on intensity, and that intensity often extended beyond performance. He did not want his characters to simply appear strong. He wanted the audience to feel that strength through impact, movement, and visible strain. Over time, that approach became part of his identity. It also carried risk. During the production of Rocky IV, that risk became clear. Stallone insisted on a level of physical realism that went beyond standard choreography. He pushed for contact that would translate as real force on screen. Dolph Lundgren, his co-star, delivered powerful punches during filming. The result was not controlled impact. It was genuine damage. Stallone was hospitalized after sustaining serious injury, including swelling around his heart. What was intended to enhance authenticity crossed into something far more dangerous. The incident did not slow the expectation. If anything, it reinforced it. The story of the injury became part of the film's reputation. Audiences heard about it. Media repeated it. The narrative strengthened Stallone's image as someone who did not step back from pain. That image brought attention, but it also set a standard that was difficult to maintain. Arnold Schwarzenegger faced a different kind of pressure. His image depended on consistency. He was expected to appear larger than life in every role, every appearance, and every public setting. His physique was not just a feature. It was central to his presence on screen. Maintaining that level required constant discipline, strict routines, and a schedule that left little room for variation. As the years progressed, the demands increased for both men. Each new film needed to match or exceed the last. Training intensified. Diets became more controlled. Filming schedules extended. The expectation was clear. They had to look stronger, move faster, and perform at a higher level each time. The audience saw the result, not the process. On screen, the characters appeared controlled, powerful, and unaffected by strain. Behind the camera, the reality was different. Long hours of training, repeated takes, and physical stress accumulated. Recovery time shortened as production timelines tightened. The balance between performance and preservation became harder to maintain. Injuries were not isolated. They became part of the routine. Minor strains were ignored. Fatigue was managed rather than addressed. The focus remained on delivering the expected result. Both men operated within a system that rewarded output and visibility over long-term health. The industry moved quickly, and there was little space to step back without risking position. Public expectations added another layer. Magazine covers, interviews, and appearances required the same level of presentation as the films themselves. The image could not shift. Any visible change would invite comparison. That comparison did not remain static. It evolved with each project, each release, and each new benchmark set by the other. Over time, the standard they created became difficult to sustain. It was not only about strength or size, it was about maintaining a version of themselves that appeared constant, even as the physical cost increased. The body became both the tool and the limit. The rivalry did not directly cause every injury, but it contributed to the environment that made restraint unlikely. Each success raised expectations. Each expectation required further effort. The cycle continued without clear pause. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the accumulation of strain was evident. The performances remained strong, but the cost behind them had grown. The image of control remained intact, but the process behind it had become more demanding. Then came a shift that did not involve physical effort or endurance. It came through a decision that would affect Stallone in a different way. The impact would not be measured in injury, but in reputation. Then came the move that hurt Stallone in a completely different way, because this time, the damage was not physical. It was professional. The movie that backfired. In the early 1990s, Sylvester Stallone stood at a difficult point in his career. The action films that had built his name were still recognized, but the landscape around him was beginning to shift. Audiences were changing, expectations were evolving, and the need to expand beyond a single type of role became more urgent. It was during this period that he accepted a project that would later stand out as one of his most criticized decisions. Stop, or My Mom Will Shoot, was designed as a comedy, a departure from the intense and physical roles that had defined Stallone's image. The concept placed him in a lighter setting, paired with a story that relied on contrast rather than force. On paper, it offered a chance to show range. In execution, it struggled to connect with audiences and critics alike. The reaction was immediate and difficult to ignore. Reviews focused on tone, structure, and performance, often pointing out how far the film moved from the strengths that had built Stallone's reputation. Instead of expanding his image, the project exposed a gap between expectation and delivery. The audience that had followed him through action films did not fully accept the change, and new viewers were not drawn in strongly enough to compensate. What made the situation more complex was the connection to Arnold Schwarzenegger. Before Stallone committed to the role, Arnold's name had already been linked to the project. The film had circulated within the industry, and interest from different actors had been discussed. This connection added another layer to the decision, one that extended beyond the script itself. Arnold later explained that he had expressed interest in the project, fully aware of how Stallone might respond. The rivalry between them had already shaped how each approached opportunities. A project associated with one could quickly become attractive to the other. not only for its potential success, but for what it represented within that ongoing competition. When Stallone accepted the role, the context shifted. The decision was no longer only about exploring comedy. It became part of a larger pattern where choices were influenced by positioning rather than pure fit. Once production began, the direction was set. There was no easy way to reverse course without visible consequence. As the film moved through release, the response did not improve. Critics described it as weak, unfocused, and out of place within Stallone's body of work. The performance was not seen as a natural extension of his strengths. Instead, it was viewed as an attempt that did not align with the image he had built over years of disciplined roles. The outcome affected more than a single project. It influenced how Stallone's decisions were viewed at that stage of his career. After a decade defined by control, intensity, and calculated risk, this film stood out as a misstep. It suggested a moment where direction had shifted without clear grounding. Arnold's later comments reinforced that perception. By acknowledging his earlier interest and understanding how Stallone might react, he framed the situation in a way that highlighted the role of rivalry in the decision. It turned the project into more than a creative experiment. It became an example of how competition could influence judgment. For Stallone, the experience carried a lasting impact. It demonstrated how quickly momentum could change when a decision did not align with established strengths. It also showed how external factors, including rivalry, could shape choices in ways that were not immediately visible at the time. The reviews were harsh, but the deeper wound came from knowing how easily rivalry had pushed him into the wrong room. Pride becomes the weakness. The fallout from Stop, or My Mom Will Shoot, did not end when the film left theaters. It stayed attached to Sylvester Stallone in a way that went beyond a single project. For years, his career had been defined by control. He chose his roles carefully, shaped his characters, and built a reputation on discipline. This time, the results suggested something different. It showed that one decision had not followed the same pattern. The discussion around the film focused on more than its performance. It raised questions about how the decision had been made. The connection to Arnold Schwarzenegger gave those questions more weight. The idea that a rival's interest could influence a major career move shifted how the situation was viewed. It was no longer only about a script or a role. It became an example of how competition can affect judgment. Arnold's public remarks added to that perception. By explaining that he had shown interest in the project, he presented the situation as a calculated move. His comments were direct and clear. They suggested awareness of how Stallone might respond. The contrast between the two men became more defined through that explanation. One appeared deliberate, the other appeared reactive. This contrast stood out because of Stallone's history. His rise had been built on persistence and belief in his own direction. He had written Rocky under pressure and refused to compromise on playing the lead. That decision showed independence. It showed confidence in his own path. The situation with Stop, or My Mom Will Shoot, appeared different. It suggested that external influence had entered the process in a way that had not been visible before. The rivalry between them had always been present, but this moment made its influence more visible. It showed that competition had moved beyond films and performances. It had reached decision-making itself. When choices begin to reflect positioning rather than fit, the outcome can shift quickly. For Stallone, the impact was not only external. It required a reassessment of how decisions were being made at that stage of his career. The pressure to remain ahead, to respond to every move, and to maintain position had created a pattern. That pattern did not always align with long-term direction. It could lead to choices that did not match established strengths. The situation also clarified something about Arnold's approach. His understanding of the rivalry allowed him to anticipate responses. By recognizing patterns, he could act in ways that influenced outcomes without direct involvement. This added a strategic element to the competition, one that did not rely on physical presence or performance. Once that dynamic became clear, the rivalry shifted in perception. It was no longer only about two actors competing through roles in films. It became an example of how prolonged competition can shape behavior. The focus moved from output to process, from results to decisions. The idea of ego became central in that shift. Ego can support confidence and drive, but it can also limit perspective. When decisions are influenced by the need to respond rather than the need to align, the result can move away from intended direction. In this case, that shift became visible through a single project. The experience marked a turning point. It highlighted the importance of separating competition from judgment. It showed how easily the two can become connected over time, especially within an environment that constantly encourages comparison. For both men, the rivalry continued, but its structure had changed. It was no longer defined only by films or physical presence. It carried an awareness of how influence could extend into decision-making itself. And as the years passed, that pattern began to lose its glamour, leaving both men with the cost of everything they had tried to prove. The cost finally showed. By the mid-1990s and into the early 2000s, the landscape that had once elevated Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger began to change. The action formula that had dominated theaters through the previous decade no longer held the same grip on audiences. New storytelling styles appeared. Technology expanded what films could show. Viewers started looking for something different, something that did not rely only on physical presence and large-scale confrontation. Stallone and Arnold remained recognizable figures, but the environment around them shifted quickly. New actors entered the space with different approaches, different images, and different expectations. The dominance that once seemed stable began to face constant challenge. The rivalry that had defined so much of their careers continued to exist, but it no longer controlled the direction of the industry. At the same time, the physical demands of their earlier years began to show. Decades of intense training, repeated strain, and demanding schedules had placed pressure on their bodies. What had once been maintained through discipline and routine now required adjustment. Injuries that had been managed during peak years became harder to ignore. Recovery took longer. The margin for pushing limits became smaller. For Stallone, the accumulation of physical strain reflected the intensity of his approach. His commitment to performance had involved real impact, repeated effort, and constant preparation. Over time, that approach required reconsideration. Maintaining the same level of physical output was no longer practical without consequence. Arnold faced a similar reality. His image had been built on consistency and size, requiring ongoing discipline across years. As expectations shifted and time progressed, maintaining that image required a different balance. The focus moved from expansion to preservation, from growth to stability. The change was not immediate, but it became visible. The roles they chose began to reflect awareness of that shift. Projects moved toward ensemble casts, shared focus, and adjusted pacing. The expectation of constant escalation gave way to a more measured approach. The audience recognized the transition, even if it was not always stated directly. Public appearances between the two men also began to change. Where earlier moments carried tension and comparison, later interactions showed a different tone. Conversations appeared more relaxed. Statements reflected recognition rather than opposition. The rivalry did not disappear, but it softened into something less rigid. This shift was shaped by shared experience. Both had worked through the same era, faced similar expectations, and carried similar pressures. The competition that once separated them also connected them. Few others had experienced that exact path. That understanding created a different perspective over time. The industry continued moving forward, introducing new trends and new figures. Stallone and Arnold remained part of that space, but their roles evolved. Instead of leading every conversation, they became part of a broader discussion about how the action genre had developed and changed. The cost of earlier years did not erase their achievements. It clarified them. It showed what had been required to reach that level and what had been given up along the way. The rivalry had contributed to their rise, but it had also added pressure that extended beyond the screen. In later projects, their collaborations reflected this change. Shared appearances suggested a balance that had not existed before. The focus shifted from comparison to cooperation. The audience saw two figures who had moved through competition and arrived at a different stage. The story of their rivalry remained relevant because it extended beyond individual success. It showed how sustained comparison can shape careers, influence decisions, and affect long-term outcomes. It also showed how perspective can change when time alters the conditions that once seemed fixed. That is why their story still matters. It was never just about hatred. It was about how long two men can carry pride before it starts carrying them. Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger's rivalry was not just about movies, muscles, or fame. It was about pride, insecurity, and the dangerous need to prove that one man was stronger than the other. In the end, both won, both lost, and both paid the price. If this story pulled you in, like the video, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more Hollywood stories hidden behind the spotlight. And before you leave, watch the next video shown on your screen, because another famous feud is waiting to be uncovered.